Like the office they commemorate, presidential libraries are living institutions. Certainly it is my hope that the Reagan Library will become a dynamic intellectual forum where scholars interpret the past and policymakers debate the future.
Welcome to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute's virtual event series. To fulfill President Reagan's mission of making the Reagan Library a dynamic intellectual forum, our Center for Public Affairs Programming offers lectures and forums presenting perspectives on important public policy issues of the day. Each year, we bring you 20 to 30 events from politicians, authors, members of the media, business and military leaders, and more. Since the March 2020 closure of many businesses across our great country, the Reagan Foundation is now bringing its events online to ensure that we are still delivering world-class content, even if you can't get to our hilltop to watch it in person. In this week's Center for Public Affairs virtual event, we bring you former United States National Security Advisor, Lieutenant General H.R. Mcmaster. Lieutenant General Mcmaster was the 26th Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. Upon graduation from the United States Military Academy in 1984, Mcmaster served as a commissioned officer in the United States Army for 34 years before retiring as Lieutenant General in June 2018. He is currently the Fouda Michelle Ajami Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Lieutenant General Mcmaster last spoke at the Reagan Library on December 3, 2017, when he was the National Security Advisor. He was our keynote speaker for the 5th Annual Reagan National Defense Forum, a bipartisan annual event held at the Reagan Library, which brings together key stakeholders to address the health of our national defense and to promote policies to strengthen the U.S. military. The theme of his keynote address was Reclaiming America's Strategic Confidence. During today's conversation, H.R. Mcmaster discusses his brand new book, Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World, which is a bold and provocative re-examination of the most critical foreign policy and national security challenges that face the United States, and an urgent call to compete to preserve America's standing and security. We now invite you to enjoy our virtual program, coming to you from our Air Force One Pavilion Leadership Academy Oval Office with Lieutenant General H.R. Mcmaster and Reagan Foundation and Institute Executive Director John Hybush.
General Mcmaster, H.R. Mcmaster, what a pleasure it is to have you with us at the Reagan Library, virtually of course, but what a book. I love the book. It is a tour de force. As you know, you cover the planet, every critical region on the planet in Battlegrounds, and thank you for such a great book.
Oh gosh, it's so kind of you, John. Thank you. I mean, I hope that that it sparks meaningful and civil discussions about the challenges that we're facing and what we can do to build a better future for generations to come. And it means a lot coming for you, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, 1,000 years ago, I got my master's in national security studies, in fact, during the Reagan administration, and all that history went out the window, as you know, with the demise of the Soviet Union. And I loved the book and got through it all, but it is so much great material. One day we'd love to have you physically at the library to cover all of it. I thought maybe today we could focus in mostly on Russia, on China, and some of the general topics, and then we'll leave the rest of the world for when we can see you again. Does that sound okay?
That sounds great, John, and I look forward to visiting the library again soon, I hope.
Okay, great. Just quick to give people perspective from a time frame, HR. You must have, your first year at West Point must have been the first year of the Reagan administration, or right thereabouts. Is that right?
It was 1980, and one of my first memories of standing on the plane there at West Point is the return of the Iranian hostages at the beginning of President Reagan's administration. Yeah, well, as you know, it's folklore. I think it's reality, no myth, that President Reagan really did reinstill pride in our armed forces and gave the nation, especially its military men and women, a real morale boost, right? You would have had to have experienced it being there at West Point, right? I absolutely experienced it, and you remember you had obviously the lost war in Vietnam, and followed by stagflation and the oil embargo, and just a series of setbacks that really created a crisis in confidence in the country. And And so I think if anything, we ought to maybe be encouraged by that, right? Because I think we're in an analogous situation today, and with the right leadership, we can emerge from these crises of a pandemic, a recession, social divides along the issues of race and inequality of opportunity and treatment, especially following the murder of George Floyd and the unrest associated with that, and the protests and violence and so forth that followed. And so we have a lot to do from an introspective point of view. But I think one of the ways that we can regain our pride, our national pride, which is like self-respect in an individual, it's a necessary ingredient for self-improvement, is through effective leadership. And then I think also discussing the crucial challenges we face and what we have to do together to overcome those challenges.
Yeah. At the very first sentence, you state right out, this is not a kiss and tell book. So if that's what you're looking for, go shopping somewhere else. And that's what I would expect from you. But I also got the sense, if you just read the first few chapters, you make the point that when America is divided, that's when we have our real troubles. And I think you wanted to write a book that essentially drove us towards a point of reuniting, right? In fact, if your book was Kiss and Tell and Divided, it seems like it plays right into our adversary's hands.
Right, absolutely. And I think this is what I'm hoping we can do is recognize that these aren't partisan issues. As we're engaged in this vitriolic partisan discourse, I think we ought to agree on a sound and sustainable foreign policy that delivers a future of peace and security and prosperity for our children and grandchildren.
Well, HR, in the beginning of the book, you defined for us a couple of critically important terms in the book, and I know you took thousands of words to do it well, but maybe in a nutshell for us, you can define for us what you meant by strategic narcissism and strategic empathy.
Well, thanks, John. Strategic narcissism is our tendency to view the world only in relation to us, and then to assume that what we do or decide not to do will be decisive to securing a favorable outcome. And the problem with strategic narcissism is obviously it's self-referential, and it doesn't consider the agency, the influence, the authorship over the future that others have. And so therefore, our strategies are based on what we would prefer to do rather than what the situation demands. And so strategic empathy is a corrective to that. It's a term I borrowed from the historian Zachary Shore. And strategic empathy is based on viewing complex challenges from the perspective of the other, especially rivals, adversaries, and enemies, and paying particular attention to the emotions and the aspirations that drive and constrain the other. And I think it's only when you consider that perspective, only when you apply strategic empathy to these complex challenges, can you ground your policies and strategies in reality, rather than fantasy.
Okay, now I'm going to make up a term and it has nothing to do with strategic narcissism, but I wonder if you'd agree there's essentially also strategic discontinuity. And what I mean by that is democracy has its pluses from the standpoint of being able to vote in new leaders every few years. But I wonder to what extent you think our issue is sometimes we seem to flush our leadership and strategy every 2-4 years, and that makes it difficult, right?
It has. I think, especially since the end of the Cold War, there's been a tendency among administrations to define their foreign policy mainly as a policy in opposition to that of their predecessor.
Right.
And I think we ought to recognize that these really are not to be partisan issues, whether it's Iran's 40-year-long proxy war against us, or if it's China's efforts to displace the United States and promote its authoritarian and mercantilist model at the free world's expense, or whether it's Russia's effort to drag us down and divide us and pit us against each other and diminish our confidence in who we are and in our democratic principles and institutions and processes. Or I don't think if you're a Democrat or Republican, you should determine whether or not you think it's a good idea that Kim Jong-un and the Kim family regime have the most destructive weapons on earth, right? It could go on, right? And it's very clear, obviously, that when our nation was attacked with the most devastating terrorist attack in history on September 11, 2001, those terrorists didn't didn't target Republicans or Democrats, right? They targeted Americans, right? So I hope that foreign policy can actually be a way that we can come back together and begin to implement a sustainable and sound long-term approach to foreign policy.
Yeah, you almost took us into the room with you, HR, when you got the phone call, went and interviewed with President Trump, and became the national security advisor within 3 or 4 days. And I wondered as I read that, did you take the job with President Trump because you sat there and felt like, now this guy gets it, he's heading in the right direction for the right strategy? Or actually, was it the reverse of that? It was, boy, this guy needs some help. I've got to throw myself into this to ensure we go in the right direction, or maybe a mix of both. I don't know.
Well, at the time, John, I was in my 33rd year of service in our Army, and as you mentioned, like I went to West Point as President Reagan took office. So this is now my 5th commander-in-chief. I did the job as National Security Advisor, still in uniform. So for me, it was the easiest decision in the world, right? It was to continue to serve my country and to serve the newly elected president. And of course, as National Security Advisor, it's a unique position in the foreign policy establishment, because it's a position in which you really have the president as his or her only client for a National Security Advisor. And so it's important, I think, for a National Security Advisor to give the president multiple options to assist the elected president with implementing his policies and decisions consistent with his agenda, right? Because he's the person that got elected. And so for me, that was easy to do. And what I describe in the final chapter are the mechanisms I put in place to try to do that in a competent way and an effective way for the president.
Yeah, an opportunity of a lifetime, right? COVID-19, the country's in so much disarray over this crisis. And I, not having been there to see it, I just wonder to what extent, HR, you feel like not just that problem, but any major problem the United States has faced under the Trump administration, is it in that world I used to live in, you had a domestic policy council staff, an economic policy council staff, there was a decision-making structure that went up the chain, everything got vetted between all the agencies. Is that absent in the Trump administration because of his style? And I'm not saying it, that can't succeed, or no, were all those mechanisms still in place when you were there, but they just weren't treated as seriously? I just wonder what's happened at the top with respect to decision-making.
Well, John, I can only talk about the 13 months I was there, right? And during those 13 months, I endeavored to put into place, and did put in place, a process that would generate really, I think, the best analysis of the crucial challenges we faced across the departments and agencies, and then present the president with multiple options for policies and strategies that aimed to advance our influence, to promote security and promote American prosperity. And I think we got good outcomes in that 13 months by presenting those multiple options to the president. I think most significant among the shifts in foreign policy was the shift to a competitive approach to China, for example. But there are many other examples on Iran, the policy toward the Middle East, the South Asia strategy. Now, sadly, from my perspective anyway, many of those decisions have been walked back from. And there are now policies in place that I think are not as beneficial to our interests in some cases, while others are intact and I think are effective. So it's mixed, but I can't really talk about what happened after I left. But we did put in a process, I think, that served the president well for that period of time. What's interesting, John, though, is I think to me, or maybe mildly surprising to me, is that there are people, certainly within the administration, that don't want the process to be effective, right? And those are people who might be serving in an administration not to give the president options so that he might implement his agenda, but instead they're there to manipulate decisions consistent with their agenda. And there are others, such as the anonymous writer, I think reflects this mentality that they cast themselves in the role of saving the country and the world from the president. What's wrong, I think, about that kind of an approach is that nobody elected these people to make policy. They're not accountable to the American people. And so they're actually undermining the Constitution because sovereignty rests people. And if those who think that it's their job to check the president or slow roll policies, well, that's not where our checks and balances lie. Right? They don't lie within kind of the administrative state. They lie in the legislative branch and in the judiciary, and of course, ultimately with the people.
Yeah, I know professionally you've been a military officer your whole career. You're also a historian. There's a great quote in your book, HR, which you say, supposition about the future should begin with an understanding of how the past produces the present. Now, I'm going to give you an unfair question. Which of the two capabilities are more important? If you can only select one to become the national security advisor, is it better to have a sense of history, or is it better to have plain old national security experience? You have to pick one.
I would say sense of history. I also say sense of humor.
I should have made that another choice.
Because I was given this great gift, John, of being able to study history full time in graduate school. The Army gave me that gift at the University of North Carolina, and I wrote a book on Vietnam about why Vietnam became an American war, focused on national security decision making and policy making and strategy development, and the pitfalls that occurred in that period of time. And in the conclusion of Battlegrounds, I write about walking into George Bundy's office is how I viewed it, and thinking, hey, the process that I criticized from a historical perspective, well, now I'm responsible to run it, right? So I tried to design that process to at least avoid making the same mistakes that I had written about during Vietnam, during the period in which Vietnam became an American war.
Okay, now you in your book evaluate our enemy's success or lack thereof in terms of their ability to divide us, really. And it seems like right now they're winning that war, aren't they?
Yeah, I think you're right. You're right. I think the main point I want to make is when are we going to stop being our own worst enemy, right? I think that Russia can't create these divisions in our society, but they can exploit them. And I write about, again, the phrase that you mentioned about how the past produced the present. There's a great deal of continuity in what Russia's doing. It goes back to Soviet efforts in the 20s and 30s to divide us on issues of race back then, right? And in the 2016 election and the attacks on our election, I try to place that in context of this much broader campaign, much broader campaign of political subversion against us, a campaign that aims to divide us mainly on issues of race. About 80% of the Russian bot and troll traffic, this Internet Research Agency, this front for the GRU and the SVR, Russian intelligence organizations, military intelligence organizations, it was on issues of race. Distant second, were issues of immigration and then gun control. And so whatever issue they can use to divide us, they will do that. But the attacks on the election themselves, John, I don't think they care who wins our elections. I don't think they think it's within their power to determine the outcome. First of all, because of the size of our country, how decentralized our system is, and so forth. What they want to do is shake our confidence in the outcome, and ensure that whoever's elected, that there's a legitimacy problem, and that election can be used to divide us further. That's really what they're trying to do. It's what they tried to do in 2016 as well.
Okay, great. That's a perfect segue moment to another quote from your book. I want to read it to you, HR. You say that Russian disinformation is designed to shake citizens' belief in their common identity and their democratic principles by manipulating social media, planting false stories, and creating false personas. I know it's impossible to put a percentage number on this, but is our divisive, national percentage number right now due in great part to their actions, or does it just take a pinprick to launch these things as we see them today?
Well, it has a lot to do with our vulnerabilities, and relatively new vulnerabilities, especially in connection with how vitriolic the partisan discourse is these days. Our political elites are very divided, so it's very easy to exploit that. But then it's also the media landscape, John. I think it's a real travesty that if you lean toward one political direction, you watch one cable news channel. If you lean in the other direction, you watch one of two other cable news channels. Just the debates that happened recently, the debate was canceled that resulted in 2 town halls for the 2 presidential candidates on separate networks, right? So we're not grounded in sort of a common information space and authoritative sources of information. You have now the growth of the pseudo media that uses disinformation and conspiracy theories and so forth already. And that environment can be used certainly to divide us further. And then you have social media, which is probably the most devastating of these environments, because the business model of these companies is to divide us by getting more clicks, which is more advertising money, and the way they do that is to show users of social media more and more extreme content. Okay, you like this? Well, you aren't going to like this even better, and that drives us apart from each other. And so it's a dangerous environment in terms of our social fabric and how it's tearing us apart. And so what I read about in the book is we really need a concerted effort to bring Americans back together. This education, I think, is probably the most important battleground, so to speak, that we have to prevail on.
Yeah, and in fact, it is so pervasive that all you need to do is go right to quotes from our president. And sometimes he uses a poor choice of words, but I know when he calls the Fourth Estate, the American media, the enemy of the people, and talks about NATO is obsolete. Again, I'm not picking on President Trump. It's just that's right.
That's being our own worst enemy. For us, what that is, I described Putin's strategy as disruption, disinformation, and denial, right? And Putin denies even the most brazen and obvious acts of aggression, right? I mean, when he tries to poison somebody with nerve agent, whether it's Sergei Skripal and his daughter in Salisbury, England, in April of 2017, or whether it's his opponent Navalny just last month, or shoots down an airliner over Ukraine. Says, well, that wasn't us, even though there are photos, of the Russian missile shooting down the civilian airliner. And so we shouldn't make it easy for him, right? We shouldn't give him that space to deny these most brazen acts and oftentimes literally get away with murder. So yeah. I think this is very important for Americans across the political spectrum, right? To not compromise our principles for partisan political advantage. And I tell the story in Battlegrounds about how both parties engaged in that kind of a compromise in 2016 and made us more vulnerable.
Yeah. I totally agree with you. I don't think the Russians helped elect or unelect anybody in 2016. But there was a statistic in your book which just stunned me, and that was on this issue of the Black Lives Matter and the whole police situation. Over 1,000 videos from that IRA unit alone on that one subject. I mean, that's phenomenal.
And that's 2016, 2017, 2018. This is before the murder of George Floyd and the protests afterwards. So they are just as active now. Now we're more effective against them now. John, I'm proud of what we did when I was in the White House to lay the groundwork and then affect changes in cyber policy that made our defense stronger by combining it with a good offense. And then I think we have to, but really the main defense for us is going to be to come back together as a people, to be civil to one another, right? To reject extremists on both ends of the political spectrum, who are using violence, or advocating for violence instead of taking advantage of the great gift of our country, and that we actually do have a say in how we're governed. Right? Yeah. This is the radical idea of our revolution that we ought to take pride in. And if you want change, I mean, vote in somebody who's going to meet your expectations.
Yeah, right. RT, Russian television, you point to that as one of these insidious forces that they're using. I wonder, do you see Russian televisions in some respect kind of like the flipped side of the coin? It's like their version of our Radio Free Europe. I mean, is it same approach to things?
No, I think what we do is we use truth, right? And they use disinformation. They use untruth. They use conspiracy theories. And so I really see what we would do, what we do with Radio Free Europe, what we did with Radio Free Europe, what we did with the U.S. Information Agency years ago, and what we do now with our government-sponsored, media and and information programs is we tell it the way it is, and much of that coverage, as you know, that gets broadcast into closed societies is critical of the United States, but critical in a way that shows an example of this is what freedom of speech looks like, right? This is what having a say in how you're governed looks like. This is what rule of law looks like, and I think that's a very important example to the world now, because I do think we are in a competition, much like President Reagan acknowledged and galvanized us to compete more effectively. It is a competition again between closed authoritarian systems and our free and open societies.
Yeah. You point many times, HR, in the book, to what we now refer as big tech as one of the issues here, and it just seems to me, I wonder if you agree, it's like a double-edged sword. Like on the one hand, we want big tech to get better at helping sort fact from fiction and building algorithms that will help drive the truth as opposed to disinformation. But at the same time, the flip side of that is, here we go with censorship, right? And this New York Post story this past week is just one more example, right? How do you get big tech to get it right?
Yeah. Well, what I propose in the book are obviously higher standards, but standards that do not cross over into censorship, such that big tech becomes the arbiters of free speech, right? That would be a huge, another problem, or maybe even a more severe problem. I think there are opportunities to hold companies responsible for content that causes harm, and to remove their immunity from lawsuits, for example. And so I think that is one approach that I think could work. And another is just for us to reject this information, right? To be better judges of what is extreme and content and disinformation, and for us to be able to make those judgments. I tell the story of a small startup here that's just got going when I was writing the story called Soap AI, and essentially what this small company does is it goes to authoritative sources for information, and on any big issue that's kind of bubbling up, that's what the soap metaphor, right? Is that it will access those multiple sources of information and make those available to you. So if you want to know what policy analysts are saying on X, you can find that. What are the major news outlets saying? Okay, what are celebrities saying maybe about this topic? Mm-hmm. And so I think there may be ways, instead of trying to shut down every source of disinformation, to elevate and highlight reliable sources of information, such that these sources of disinformation are diminished in their impact.
Yeah, let's talk about anonymity for a minute. I just wonder if I read it in your book, the phrase you used, you wrote, we need to be about removing the cloak of anonymity. And when I saw that, and I'm talking about in social media, I wonder if you would go as far as I would. I've been so frustrated over this. I mean, if I could have Congress, if they would pass a law that outlawed social media commentary under an anonymous name or a pseudonym or any other such name. I mean, because it just seems that's a source of trouble for America.
Right. I think you're right about that. That, of course, John, what's so complicated about these issues is there's a downside to any policy.
Yeah.
Right? The downside there is, if people live in a closed authoritarian system, and they may need anonymity to survive, and so to be able to express themselves without being persecuted by an authoritarian regime, we see how China is perfecting, right, this Orwellian technologically enabled surveillance police state, right, and closing down any space at all for even the most mild criticism of the Chinese Communist Party. So that, I mean, with all of these policy decisions, there is a downside. What is extremely important, I think, for us is to establish standards for data protection, right? For protecting our personal data, because that is the prize for many of these companies. We are the commodity for a lot of these companies, and we already know that the Chinese Communist Party, for example, is harnessing as much of that data as they can to weaponize against us. And this is why, having your teenagers on TikTok is a really bad idea, right? Because that data is going to the Chinese Communist Party, and I think it's unrealistic to assume that they'll treat us better than they treat their own people.
Yeah, yeah. You also reference in the book cryptocurrency and its rise around the world, and I just give me your take on it. It's almost like it's another one of those things that, while it sounds and feels as though it could have remarkable advantages for the free market system, at the same time, there's the flip side there as well, right? It's leading to so much crime and the dark web and those things. Where would you come out on cryptocurrency?
Yeah, I think what we have to do, so cryptocurrency is empowering because it cuts out the middleman, right? It empowers consumers. It's a very democratic way of exchange, right? And so I think that what we would want to do is be a leader along with other free and open countries in the area of fintech, which would be a way to at least lessen the degree to which this is a problem associated with the dark web and a whole range of illicit activities, illicit financial transactions, and so forth. And we're behind. We're behind. China is innovating much faster. They have an unfair advantage because they close their market to any competitors from the West. And companies like Alibaba, Alipay, and so forth can become dominant just based on the sheer scale of the Chinese market alone, and then can gain unfair advantage outside of their borders as well. But this is a key contested space, right? Is fintech, and we ought to take the lead on it. I know people didn't want to give Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook their access to their wallets with Facebook fintech solution, but I think I'd rather do that than give it to Alipay. So
right.
So I think that we have to take advantage of some of the competitive advantages we have with our tech companies, but do so in a way that protects our citizens, our privacy, and that also maintains the access that law enforcement needs to prevent the worst behavior. I just think child trafficking, for example, and other nefarious actions that can and crimes that can occur if we don't have that kind of visibility.
Yeah. Okay. Now you were in the perfect job to be able to answer this. Is there a strong enough bridge of cooperation in your mind between the NSA, the U.S. Cyber Command, big tech? I mean, the guys that should be working together to tackle some of these problems, or are the government agencies stiff-armed by the private sector on that?
Yeah, I think it's getting better, John. And so, I'm sitting here in Palo Alto and at Stanford. And I think it's getting better. We run at the Hoover Institution a Tech Track 2 dialogue, which I've found to be immensely useful in bringing together senior government people and senior executives within the tech industry. And we have common problems. And I hope what the book will do is in part make more of us aware of the challenges we face, and make us more aware that these challenges cut across not just our government, not just our military, and they require much more than military and diplomatic and government solutions. These challenges cut way into the private sector, into academia, and so we all have to be aware of the challenges and work together to overcome them. And I'm talking maybe in particular in this case on various Chinese Communist Party forms of economic aggression. This would be the forced transfer of sensitive technologies and intellectual property, combined with the sustained campaign of industrial espionage against us that aims to steal our most sensitive technologies and apply them in really a dual-pronged effort under their program of military civil fusion, which is to gain a position of dominance in the emerging data globalized economy, and then also to gain a differential advantage over our military forces by giving the People's Liberation Army advanced capabilities. We should not be participating in that. We should, we should try do our best to defend ourselves and maintain our competitive advantages economically and from a security perspective as well.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, because you took us into China, which is exactly where I wanted to go. Neither you or I are, I'm sure, going to advocate the United States drives towards socialism and implements central planning and all the rest of that. But as you quote in your book, they're not doing too bad. 800 million people from poverty into a middle class in China in the last couple of decades. I mean, that's a remarkable feat, right?
It is. It is. It is. And I think we helped with that. We, the West, with certainly with U.S. investments and it's I think the Chinese people should get credit for that. As you know, they were coming from a pretty low point based on the Great Leap Forward, which was a great leap backward, and the Cultural Revolution, which oppressed the Chinese people, and that there was reason for hope, I think, in the 90s. After the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, we didn't impose costs on China really significantly for that, in the hopes that China, having been welcomed into the international community, giving China most favored nation status in the 90s, and then admitting China into the World Trade Organization in 2001. All this was based on the assumption, to use Bob Zoellick's term, that China would become a responsible stakeholder. China would play by the rules, and then as China prospered, it would liberalize its economy and it would liberalize its form of governance. Well, now, John, I mean, we know that's not the case, right? The opposite has occurred. And the Chinese Communist Party is doing everything it can to extend and tighten its exclusive grip on power internally, with a campaign of cultural genocide, by the way, in Xinjiang, as well as the national security law and the extension of its repressive arms, into Hong Kong. And as I mentioned, the weaponization of people's social networks against them with the social credit score and the perfection of the surveillance state. I mean, it's really, it's far beyond what Orwell imagined could be possible in the fictitious Oceania in the novel 1984. But they're also now being more aggressive externally. So if they succeed, I mean, the world will be less free, less prosperous, and less safe.
Would you agree the Chinese, with respect to not just intelligence services, but their ability to theft of IP, technology, and the rest of that, it seems to me these guys make the KGB look like pikers, right? I mean, that's my sense.
Yeah, I mean, they are persistent. They are innovative. If they want to get into a U.S. company, for example, that has technology that they want, they look at every aspect of that company as a point of entry. There is the cyber-enabled industrial espionage that APT-10, their hacking arm, undertakes. But there's also physical infiltration and espionage that occurs routinely. There's also just the brazen coercion of companies. I describe the Chinese approach as co-option, coercion, and concealment. Co-opt you in, right, with the lure of short-term profits and access to their market. Once you're in, coerce you to get what they want, which is in large measure your technology, your know-how, and then to portray all this as this is just normal business practices. Well, it's really not normal business practices, especially once that technology is applied to a Chinese national company, which they all have to act as an extension of the Chinese Communist Party. So their companies are not like our companies. But then these are companies that are subsidized, that produce these goods at artificially low prices, and then those goods are oftentimes dumped on the international market in a way that drives us out of business. This is why we used to have, I think the number's 32 solar panel manufacturers in the United States, and now we have, I think, 2 left. So I think, when Ross Perot, remember Ross Perot in the when he was talking about NAFTA, called it the great sucking sound, in terms of U.S. jobs. Well, he was right about it, except that sucking sound was not to Mexico; it was to China. and I'm not advocating, for a protectionist policy, but I do think the Trump administration's use of trade enforcement mechanisms is correct if it gets China to then adhere to a fair and reciprocal economic arrangement. right? That's what I think ought to be the goal.
Yeah, yeah. How about on the academic side, the Chinese students, for example? I in the book, I think you make a point that, here's my question. How do we separate the spies from, legitimate students really wanting to make a contribution to America?
Right, right. Well, we don't want universities to become the FBI, right? Let's let the FBI, I think, do that. But there has to be just a degree of responsibility, especially in areas that are sensitive in connection with government-funded research, for example. So there's a really excellent program here at the Hoover Institution now under the direction of Larry Diamond called the China Global Sharp Power Initiative. And a recent report that I had the privilege of writing the foreword for lays out a model. This is how you can evaluate your research activities in academia, but I think it's relevant to corporations as well. And to just have the basic screening in place to make sure you're not inviting PLA, People's Liberation Army scientists, into the Department of Energy and Department of Defense or related research or sensitive biogenomic research, for example. So I think this is immensely important. The private sector must be involved. Of course, we don't want universities to become the FBI or to be counterintelligence organizations, but companies need to be. I mean, companies, if they value their intellectual property, if they value their source code, if they value the hardware they're manufacturing, think about the Supermicro incident, for example. I mean, they have to be diligent, and they have to. I think any companies that own data have to view our data like gold and their company as Fort Knox, right? They're just not going to let anybody in to steal it, right? And so the expectations have to be much different than they've been, because we've had some flawed assumptions about the intentions of Chinese leadership. And one thing I would highlight is universities can't go wrong in taking actions to protect Chinese students, Chinese nationals who are at their universities from coercion. What's really, I think, a sad story is how the Chinese Students and Scholars Association is an arm of the Ministry of State Security to monitor those students. And so there have been many cases of a Chinese student saying something mildly critical about the Chinese Communist Party, and their parents get a knock on the door back in China and get threatened, right? So we should try to protect the sanctity of our academic environments. And I don't think anybody can fault us for that, right? Or university administrators for that, certainly.
Yeah. I hope that report of yours gets distribution far and wide in the academic circles. We could truly use it.
There's another one too that was also done at Hoover on Chinese influence and Chinese Communist Party influence. That's also quite good. That talks about academia and different sectors as well. Think tanks, for example, as a target of the party. And what the party does, I mean, their traditional method has been to co-opt elites and dominate the narrative. Now they're becoming more sophisticated. They're starting to take some pages out of Russia's playbook as well.
Mm-hmm. Talk about the One Belt, One Road situation. If there's anything that's ever rang to me like the company store model writ large internationally by the Chinese, this is it, right? It's insidious. Can you talk about that for a moment?
Right, and it fits into this model of co-option, coercion, and concealment. So what China is doing is creating servile relationships across the Indo-Pacific. I think it's a new version of the tributary system under Chinese empires, in which they've come to a country with what seems like a really good deal, which is actually loans for huge infrastructure projects, really on pretty bad terms, overly in-debt countries for projects that will not give them a return on investment, and then they use that indebtedness for leverage against that country, and oftentimes as well, trading debt for equity and sometimes physically taking over infrastructure. The countries that they're targeting are those that are most susceptible to it because of corruption, for example. So not the current government of Ecuador, but a previous government of Ecuador was susceptible. Built a huge dam for a ridiculous amount of money, dam that really didn't work well in terms of power generation. But Ecuador has given up all of their oil exports to China from that moment on at a discount, every year. Sri Lanka, traded off debt for equity for a port it didn't need and still doesn't use really for commercial purposes. And China took over that port in a strategic location. There's a reason why there are Chinese companies running both ends of the Panama Canal, for example. And this is also what they do with 5G technologies, offer a great discount. Hey, you don't have to pay anything for the first 3 years, X country, but give us your communications infrastructure. And then, of course, the price is all of your data that's sensitive to your own security and to your economic viability is now in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. So I think countries are waking up to it. John, there's a very Reagan-esque, I think, chapter in the second chapter of China, which is to turn what the Chinese Communist Party perceives as weakness into our strengths, and those are the principles we hold dear in terms of freedom of speech, freedom of the press, right? Investigative journalists have done a great job exposing this kind of behavior. John Garneau in Australia, I mean, he was a superstar and inspired many others, I think, to expose how China exerts its influence internationally.
Yeah. I wonder what your view is on, if there's any of the 7 deadly sins that the Fortune 500 is responsible for, it would be greed, right? And that's what leads to so much of this IP transfer, this carelessness, and the rest of that. Are there any hard and fast, smart regulatory moves or legislation you think that's necessary to try to blunt that?
Yeah, I think there are a number of things we could do, John. Right. So I think one is that we ought to create a form of ethical guidelines for international companies doing business inside of authoritarian regimes. I'm working on something like that now with my amazing team of Stanford student research assistants to consult with with ethics experts and business experts. And I think in general, John, I mean, what I would put at the top of it is U.S. companies and countries of other democracies. And I think we ought to enter into this agreement together, right? Because companies oftentimes say, well, if I confronted the Chinese Communist Party on this, I'll lose market share, and a German company or a Japanese company will move in. But I think we ought to all agree that we will adhere to local laws, but only if those local laws do not violate maybe the Universal Declaration on Human Rights that we all signed during the UN Charter. For example, these would be the same that are in our Declaration of Independence, our Bill of Rights, but I mean, for an international perspective. And then I think then what we can also do is do more to help companies that are subjected to the coercive power of the Chinese Communist Party by working internationally not to accept these non-tariff barriers to entry to the market that make you sacrifice your company's principles or your sensitive technologies. And then finally, I would do something maybe counterintuitive. How about, I recommend this in the book, what about offering visas to Chinese national employees of U.S. companies, in our case, and their families, if they are subjected to the coercive power of the party, and allow them to leave. I mean, I tell the story of George H.W. Bush during the Tiananmen Square massacre, when he said, hey, if you're a Chinese student in the United States, you can have a green card. Now, there are far fewer Chinese students in the United States then than there are now, but 58,000 Chinese students took him up on it. And they're some of our greatest citizens. They're some of our most productive entrepreneurs, So I think, the initial reaction might be, stop the Chinese from coming over. I say, bring more on if they share our values, right? And if they respect, what we respect, which is tolerance and freedom and rule of law.
Yeah. Okay. Last question on China, and then we'll wrap up soon, I promise. President Trump will go down in history, and he'll be famous for his tweets, no doubt about that. But I think one thing that will stand out that he will be known for was finally the guy, maybe clumsily at times, that woke us up about China and all of these issues that you just talked about, right?
I think that's right, John. I think that I had the privilege of serving as National Security Advisor during this shift in an early meeting. I think it might have been maybe March. I came in February, March, I think, of 2017. We convened the Principals Committee, which is the President's cabinet, mostly those involved with the national security, for what we called a small group framing session on China. And I read a couple of excerpts from previous policies to highlight the fundamental assumption that we knew turned out to be false, right? That China would play by the rules and liberalize. And just noted that in that discussion, we were about to begin one of the most significant shifts in U.S. foreign policy, probably the most significant shift in U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War.
Let's end it with President Reagan. HR, there's probably, in my opinion, the best quote that I remember before, and it's this: democracy is, we don't pass this down in the bloodstream from generation to generation. It's really only through civic responsibility, civic engagement on the part of American citizens that creates the fabric of who we are, right? And you spoke to this earlier, but let's just end it with here. Give us your thoughts on what really is the obligation of every American citizen in that regard.
Yeah, I think it's to do what our founders asked us to do, which is to nurture our democracy. And I think that now more than ever, John, the work of the Reagan Foundation in civic education, the great work that you do, it's more important than ever, right? I think that we have lost sight of who we are. We don't recognize really the great gift that we've been given in this country. And of course, our historical record, our experience is not without disappointments. But we ought to be proud that we can be the authors of our own future. We can demand better. We can strengthen our society and our sense of who we are. So I think if all of us can just take away from the crisis from which we're emerging, a sense of duty and purpose, a sense of duty to one another, and the purpose, I think, ought to be to strengthen our democracy.
Yeah, well put, well put. Really important reading for America. General HR, I thank you for writing this really great piece of literature, and it's a study that a lot of people ought to be reading, and we can't thank you enough for being with us today, and best of luck to you up at Hoover, and best of luck with this book, okay?
John, thank you so much. What a pleasure it is to be with you, and thanks for the privilege of getting to know the Reagan Foundation over the years and participating in the wonderful events you put on, and you are just a great service to our nation. So thanks to you and your leadership as well.
Best to you, HR. Take care.
Take care, John. Thanks.
We hope this conversation has inspired you to share what you've learned with your family and friends, and that you'll join us again for an upcoming event.
And let me offer lesson number 1 about America. All great change in America begins at the dinner table. So tomorrow night in the kitchen, I hope the talking begins. And children, if your parents haven't been teaching you what it means to be an American, let them know and nail them on it. That would be a very American thing to do.